center stage. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Kadri Simson, who's a distinguished visiting fellow here at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and is also a Carnegie Distinguished Fellow at our Institute of Global Politics at SIPA. I'm also pleased to be joined by Tom Moerenhout, who's a CGEP research scholar and the director of our critical materials program. And last but not least, Tatiana Mitrova, who's a CGEP Global Fellow and one of our top experts on all things Eurasian energy and geopolitics. And I'm RJ Johnston. I'm the Senior Director for Research here at the Center on Global Energy Policy as well. Delighted to have everyone join us today. So what we're going to do is have a discussion. I'm going to ask our panelists some questions to kind of frame the discussion, kick things off. And then I'm going to put a link in the chat, and you'll have a chance to ask questions through that link to our team, and we'll be able to answer those questions later in the session here as well. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and begin. And Tatiana, I think I'm going to start with you because I know you've been tracking these issues for a long time here. And maybe I can just kind of ask you to start by setting the scene and basically talk a little bit about, from a broad level, how energy and critical minerals have played a central role in the conflict overall, but more recently in these negotiations about potentially ending the war in Ukraine.
Thank you, RJ. And it's a bit controversial because normally speaking, the central topic should be peace, and termination of the war, termination of the military attacks. Also for Ukraine specifically, the question of the security guarantees, territorial issues. But due to quite strong pressure, both from the US and from the Russian side, energy really became one of the central issues in the discussion. The first step was this energy infrastructure ceasefire, which just ended up yesterday. It wasn't frankly followed by both sides. At least both of them are accusing each other for violating this energy infrastructure ceasefire. Nevertheless, the number of attacks from both sides was definitely lower than before this agreement on March 18th. And it resulted on Russian side in growing refinery output, because refineries were not attacked any longer by Ukrainian drones, at least at that scale. On the Ukrainian side, actually, it resulted in much more massive attacks on civilians. And we've heard about these absolutely terrible attacks in Kryvyi Rog, in Kharkiv recently. So the whole process of these negotiations is quite controversial. The issues on the energy side, which were put on the table, are really just amazing. So it's not only security of the energy infrastructure per se, but also the ownership and operational management of the Ukrainian gas transportation system, of the Ukrainian nuclear power plants, further development of Ukrainian rare earth materials. There were also rumors, at least Russian officials were confirming it, that the question of Nord Stream revival or gas transit via Ukraine revival were also addressed, never confirmed by the US side, but at least. So it looks like energy became the most important bargaining chip in these negotiations, while the real peace talk was put aside.
Yeah, that's a great summary of all the things that have been happening on the energy side. And I forgot to say, by the way, the session is being recorded. I should have mentioned that at the beginning. And as we have a number of folks here from the CGEP community and also from the public on the call. Tom, Tatiana mentioned several things there, refineries, nuclear power plants, Nord Stream, gas transport. And I think those have all been key themes throughout the conflict. But more recently, rare earths and critical minerals, which he also mentioned, have played a somewhat prominent role here as well. So that kind of brings the question about this very high-profile meeting that Zelensky and Trump had in Washington on February 28th. At that time, as Tatiana suggested, there was an expectation that we might get a deal on critical minerals, and that's kind of been on again, off again. Looks like maybe it's on again. What's your latest sense on that critical minerals / rare earths agreement, and do you think we'll get something signed?
Yeah, thank you, RJ. So the latest is actually news from yesterday, where the economy minister of Ukraine, Yulia Sviridenko, announced that we're expecting that minerals deal to be signed next week. So yesterday, the Ukraine and the United States signed a memorandum of intent. That's just a one-pager lining out the process for the next week, if you wish. So we know that the Ukrainian Prime Minister, Shmyhal, he's traveling to Washington next week to basically facilitate the last stages of the deal. Right now, exactly what it will entail is not very clear. The US Treasury Secretary has sort of highlighted that sort of the base of the substance was actually similar to the previous draft, which means the establishment of a reconstruction investment fund where Ukraine would put in half of their revenues of future natural resources projects. And I think that's kind of important to emphasize here as well. It's really not only minerals and rare earths. We can talk a little bit more about that later, but it's natural resources in general. So natural gas, oil, different types of natural gas assets and infrastructure as well. So the deal covers much more than critical minerals alone. But the status is that, again, we will see this next week, probably being negotiated. Tatiana mentioned security guarantees. I think that's still sort of a topic on the table there, because one interesting thing in that one-pager memorandum of intent that I found was sort of a reference to the fact that Ukraine voluntarily gave up their nuclear arsenal in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. So they highlight Ukraine's role in international peace and security. So that kind of sort of is language that's suggesting that they want some type of or that they deserve some type of implicit security guarantee, right? So I think this all will still need to be ironed out in the coming days. But normally, again, I think Donald Trump yesterday mentioned that it could be signed as early as the 26th of April, so basically next week.
Gotcha. And I think, Tom, a lot of folks don't have a lot of expertise on critical minerals and rare earths in this part of the world. In particular, there's been a lot of focus on critical minerals in China and US and Canada and Latin America, other regions, Indonesia. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of what's going on in Ukraine from a below ground perspective, what the resource base looks like, how competitive it is with other countries, what kind of activity they've had in the past?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and sometimes it feels a little bit like explaining critical minerals 101. There's actually, it's not that Ukraine is not a producer. Ukraine is actually an important producer of certain critical minerals, has produced critical minerals in the past, specifically minerals like titanium, which obviously use for strengthening for national defense applications, manganese and graphite as well. But some of the other minerals are largely overstated, or are potentially largely overstated, because we know there are resources there, but resources doesn't mean that you have economically recoverable reserves. So when we talk about things like rare earths or lithium, actually we know that there is some of that stuff underground there, but most of what we know is just resources, inferred resources. So none of this is really certain yet. And we know this from back in the Soviet days. That's kind of the data that we have. So when they talk about sort of a rare earths deal, a minerals deal to diversify lithium and again rare earths from China and so forth, actually there's a lot of uncertainty there, right? So this would not only require investment. No, we go before that. We actually need to get into exploration still and making sure that these resources again are economically recoverable. Doing that, meaning say that you have an agreement on this sort of investment reconstruction fund, and there is a willingness to invest in Ukraine. These are already very big assumptions to be made. Then it would still easily take you 15, 20 years, and I'm probably being quite polite here and optimistic, before you get anything out of the ground, right? So this idea of, oh, this can help diversify US supply chains, maybe in the sort of medium to long term, but in the short term, that's just not a reality at all. Because you need to link that to also the energy intensive nature of critical mineral extraction. And of course, a lot of the infrastructure, both on the energy side, but also on the transport side, the port side, and so forth, has been destroyed because of the war. So we're looking at a very complicated sort of area to actually invest in. Not to mention that some of these interesting rare earth deposits are actually today on Russian-occupied territory, so it is very unclear how easy they could actually be developed. On the titanium and graphite side, maybe that's a different thing. They have been sort of an a relevant producer in the past, but even there, I would question the logic of diversification here, because what we really need, or what the United States really needs, is actually processed material, right? Highly refined material. And that processing or refining, we're not even talking about that in the Ukrainian context. So you might end up with a situation where Ukraine can produce some ores of some critical minerals, but then actually you need to export it elsewhere where processing is done. And most of that today is, of course, in China. So that kind of ends up with that conundrum, right? And I think that'll be sort of my last point, but I think what we've seen with the Trump administration is a very big emphasis on extraction. Greenland, domestically, Ukraine, and it's kind of what I call the crude oil mindset. You know, if you have control over resource underground, you hold power. But this was because the United States had a lot of refineries, so that makes sense. With critical minerals, the United States has very little refineries, almost no refineries whatsoever. And so this logic just doesn't really make sense anymore. They really need to look at the processing infrastructure that the United States has, and that's a completely different ball game, quite frankly. And you can't just solve your critical minerals problems there by trying to get access to other underground resources.
Yeah, you make some great points there, including the fact that there's a big exploration phase necessary to develop those resources into actual economically recoverable reserves. Who do you think would actually do that exploration? Because you and I know that exploration is kind of a challenging business in any jurisdictions, let alone ones that are under this kind of level of geopolitical uncertainty.
So the immediate answer is, if you don't have sufficient public funding going into exploration in Ukraine, I cannot see private companies doing it today.
Right.
The markets are very, very bearish, right? Prices are very low. This is not when we normally see a lot of exploration investment happening. Most of the exploration investment today happens in lithium and copper, because those are the two critical minerals where we know we will have supply deficits on the horizon. And other exploration is actually not happening that much, right? So who could do that? That would be sort of a combination, I suppose, of state-owned enterprises who are currently sort of dominating the Ukrainian minerals extraction system, and there's a lot of sort of problems with that state-owned enterprise management as well. And that would need to be backed by some type of other public funding, because I think what people often don't realize is that exploration is it sounds kind of fun and exciting, and you find something and then you discover something, you get to develop it. It's a terrible business to be in. 99% of the time you explore and you find nothing of value, and you can't produce. So the only real deposit that then you can develop, and then you can basically, you get your payday. Now what we're talking about is exploration in a war-torn territory where infrastructure has been really damaged a lot. And then if you find something, then you be able to produce and have a payday, but these are a lot of ifs. So basically, private sector funding is not going to do that. It will need to be public sector funding. Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, thanks, Tom. That's very helpful. Let me turn back to the energy side here and go back to Tatiana and Kadri, because there's a lot that's been the focus for the last 3 or 4 years, and more recently it's been critical minerals and rare earths. But maybe Tatiana, I'll ask you again about your take on the latest on the sanction side, and then I'll go to Kadri. But I think that's been a key narrative here, on both the oil and gas side, and has had disruptive effects in various ways. Can you kind of tell us the latest, what's happening in terms of the conflict and sanctions?
RJ, actually, it was also counterintuitive and very, very surprising for many analysts. So 3 years of rather tough sanctions, and especially tough farewell sanctions from Biden administration, which were imposed
Right.
on January 10, which sanctioned like half of Russian oil produced, and really imposed quite tough restrictions on Russian shadow fleet and so on. Immediate response was in January like 100,000 barrels per day reduction in the exports, and then in mid-March plus 300,000 barrels per day. So Russian oil companies adapted amazingly quickly. And for the last 3 years, they've been adapting all the time. They were building this shadow fleet. They were developing these networks of intermediaries to process financial payments. They were really redirecting flows from Europe, which banned Russian crude, to Asia and to absolutely new destinations like in South America and Africa and so on. So they've adapted, and for the last 3 years, once again, the volume of Russian seaborne crude, for example, fluctuates about 3 million barrels per day, so slightly less than before the war began, but it's not dramatic for the Russian budget. And oil and gas budget revenues were also, they were moving up and down, but basically still at quite comfortable level, even with the latest sanctions. But what has happened just recently without any sanctions? It was the decline in oil prices. The price of Urals for the last few weeks is actually about $50 per barrel. Nobody knows the exact price because it's not transparent, but we have some general assessments. And given that Russian budget is balanced at $70 per barrel, this is already a big problem. And so budget revenues for March, they were like 16% down compared to the previous months. And Russian government, central bank, financial ministry are getting more and more worried and regard it as the major risk for the Russian economy if the global economic slowdown due to the tariff wars will stay there, if oil prices will be at the level of $50 to $60 per barrel. This is really undermining Russia's military machine without any sanctions, just the rule of market.
Well, Kadri, you dealt with this issue rather directly as the EU Energy Commissioner and have some frontline experience in this. What's the perspective from the European Union at this point? I mean, obviously, you're no longer actively involved, but you're still following things very closely. When you look at the effectiveness of the sanctions regime and where it's likely to evolve here and the sort of end stages of the war, what do you think is going to happen from what are the Europeans hoping to see?
Yes, good morning from New York, and I am here to share with you the European perspective. So I wanted to start by sharing with you that Ukraine has always been an important partner for Europe in energy sector, and not because Ukraine produced a lot of electricity, excess capacity was there until Russians started to destroy their power plants, and not because Ukraine is producing itself also natural gas. Right now they are producing barely enough to cover their domestic demand, but because they were a most important transit route for Russian oil and gas. And this natural gas transit agreement just expired last year, but you have to keep in mind that at the very moment when Russians are destroying power plants, but also schools and hospitals, this gas pipeline is still intact. So this is kept untouched. And I truly believe that as Tatiana was explaining how Russians have been able to create their shadow fleet to transport crude oil, they were not as successful in the gas market because they had this plan back in 2019 when it was the last time when they negotiated Ukraine transit. They had a plan to reroute pipeline gas via Nord Stream 1 and 2 to Europe and leave Ukrainian route idle. But now when Nord Stream 1 and 2 ceased to exist, even before the 2 was commissioned, there are not many more alternative routes, and Russians were not able to build or complete also their projects towards China, pipeline gas projects towards China. So they need a route if one day they are willing to start shipping pipeline gas to Europe again. Why I'm saying that? Because right now They have limited ability to liquefy their natural gas. They do so, but this is exactly the sector where Europe has been able to at least agree on some sanctions. So last year, first time ever in our 14th package of sanctions, we covered first time LNG and transshipment actions. So there is not only limitation how much Russia can liquefy their gas, but there is also the limitation how they can transport LNG. And they used European ports, European terminals to transship from smaller vessels to bigger ones, and then sell their LNG towards Asian markets. That was not possible anymore. As a consequence, what we saw, they found buyers from European countries. So despite the fact that the LNG market is right now very liquid and European buyers do not need to buy Russian LNG, but because Russians most likely gave significant discounts because they had nothing else to do with their LNG, they did so. So coming back to Ukraine, the pipeline infrastructure is still there. And on top of that, there are massive storage sites in Ukraine that could help us to build up this strategic gas reserve. Right now, Ukrainian storage is empty. So it's 2% full. You can say it's literally empty compared to the European one, where we still do have 1/3 in the storage, and withdrawal season is over. Now we are filling already. So this transit creates a lot of uncertainty also for European gas buyers. What will happen when there will be a peace agreement? And you have to keep in mind that it was also significant revenue for Ukrainians. So when the last transit agreement was negotiated back in 2019, it was agreed that the annual revenue is 1 billion annually, and despite the volumes. So in the very end, in the end of 2024, only 1/4 of agreed volumes came to Europe, but the revenue for Ukrainians was still the same, and they kept this agreement until it expired. And then President Zelensky was very clear that they will not negotiate any other agreement unless they do have peace treaty agreed.
Thanks, Kadri. It's a great overview. And just note that we did put our link to the Q&A in the chat. So please fill out that form for Q&A in the audience, and our team will be watching for your questions as they come in, and we'll do our best to answer them. Kadri, so you mentioned a couple things there. You mentioned the storage situation in Ukraine and in Europe. You mentioned the physical infrastructure and the availability of alternative transit routes. What do you think the Europeans are worried about in terms of a possible disruption? Is there concern that maybe we won't get enough storage over the next winter? Is there concern about the physical safety of that infrastructure if the ceasefire doesn't happen? What's the kind of latest? What keeps the Europeans up at night at this point?
Well, since the oil crisis in the 70s, we have created strategic oil reserve. And now starting since this Russian manipulation of our gas markets, we also took control over our gas storages because strangely enough, when we took this hit by Russian Gazprom, we saw that many big storage sites in Europe were owned by Gazprom. So some of our governments had to nationalize them because this is strategic asset for our gas market. And well, what is also interesting, it was Gazprom who published last year official statement that they took significant losses last year. So this is also a good sign that they have not been able to find alternative routes to sell their gas. So what is happening in the crude oil market is different than what is happening in the gas market. For us, European Union, it is still the case that gas is traded with Russia, but this is their decision whom they sell and whose long-term contracts they respect and whose not. And that, as it was just announced, 6th of May, European Commission will present a roadmap how to get rid of remaining Russian fossil fuel import. And that, of course, plays important role in this regard, that Russia will lose some of the revenues, but it also sends a very clear message to European entrepreneurs that you do not have to be afraid that Russian gas returns. Vice versa, you can well sign long-term contracts with LNG providers, and this is this goodwill act towards Trump, who so much wants to balance the trade and sell more LNG to Europe. And how Europe can do that, we created Aggregate EU tool, and this is this buying platform, but on behalf of all EU countries, Europe buys LNG and then takes care that this gas is also delivered to landlocked countries who don't have their own LNG terminals.
Right. So Tatiana, you're tracking all these issues pretty closely as well, both Russia's efforts to find new markets, but also the likely effectiveness of this EU plan that's about to be implemented to eliminate remaining Russian oil and gas dependency. What's your perspective both on Russia's ability to diversify those markets, especially for gas, and then how do you think this EU plan is going to turn out?
Well, first of all, I would echo what Kadri said. Indeed, gas market and oil markets for Russia these days are completely different. And while Russia has really adapted quite well on the oil space, with gas, it's far more challenging. And Gazprom, Novatek, also, they are reporting quite impressive losses. Because indeed diversifying gas supplies is far more difficult because of the nature of the gas pipelines and also strictness of the sanctions on LNG fleet, which were imposed by the US specifically, but also supported by the European Union decisions on LNG transshipment. Right now, Russian gas flows to Europe only via Turk Stream, which is outside the EU jurisdiction, and there are several countries inside EU which are still glad to receive this gas. And also these LNG volumes, which are directed specifically to the European markets, they still keep coming, though there is this discussion how to get rid of it. Given the forthcoming LNG wave, all these massive amount of new projects to be commissioned and to start operations next year and then 2027 and so on until the end of the decade, it will be much more comfortable for Europe actually to replace Russian LNG with the alternative supplies without threatening energy security. Russia itself tried to find the other markets. First of all, China. There was a lot of discussion about Power of Siberia 2, another massive pipeline with 50 BCM capacity, which is still in limbo. So China didn't demonstrate any real appetite to subscribe for this project, to sign offtake agreement. And moreover, I've heard from the Chinese officials that actually Russia became already #1 gas supplier to China, and they don't want to increase this dependency anymore, at least for the time being in the current geopolitical situation. So they keep it as an option if the further confrontation with the US, let's say, will appear, then potentially Russian gas could become more attractive for China, but not at the moment. Russia is looking also at the different diversification routes, again, to China, but via Kazakhstan or through Azerbaijan, Iran to the Gulf with further either liquefaction or pipeline to India. You know, these dream paper projects, which are there under discussion for the last 20 years, but have very little chance to happen. The main bet was on LNG until the end of 2023. So there was this, and I think it's still officially fixed, this target of 120 million tons of Russian LNG export by 2035, which is a lot. But the decisions of the Biden administration to sanction Arctic LNG 2 project, and then actually this year to impose additional sanctions on the smaller projects, that actually Arctic LNG 2 had to halt its operations. The sanctions are so strict, and more importantly, the enforcement of these sanctions is really very tough. Differently, by the way, compared to the enforcement of many oil sanctions. So here the pressure is enormous. And Novatek announced already that they put on hold their new LNG projects in Murmansk and further projects in Yamal. So Russia is now redirecting this gas to the domestic market. Domestic gas demand is growing quite quickly. Gasification is ongoing. They are discussing different ways to produce, for example, ammonia, or to go for other gas chemical productions like urine, or further fertilizer production, which is easier to transport and which is directly linked with the food issues. Yeah, so it will be more difficult to sanction them without creating a lot of opposition from the global South countries. Yeah, so they're trying to find some sort of solution, but basically, of course, in terms of cash flow generation and in terms of like marginality, European market is the most attractive. Therefore, I believe in these peace negotiations, which we are discussing, the idea of going back to some sort of Nord Stream 2 utilization or Ukrainian transit utilization. And Kadri mentioned, by the way, that during these 3 years of excessive bombing, this gas transit infrastructure wasn't affected. Ukrainian gas storages were, but not the trunk pipelines. So Russia still keeps them like protected for the future, keeping these hopes that probably one day it will be allowed to start to utilize them again. At the same time, if we look specifically in February, March attacks, Russia was systemically destroying all Ukrainian gas producing facilities, trying to leave Ukraine without gas. And as for many years, Ukraine is not buying gas from Russia, it is actually buying it from Europe with these reverse flows. That means additional demand in Europe. So the idea is to frighten further Europeans, to show them, guys, you not only have to supply your domestic market, but also you have to supply Ukraine now. And maybe it is better just to go for some concessions and allow at least some volumes of Russian gas flowing into Europe. But as Kadri said, right now, it doesn't seem to be an acceptable option.
Thanks, Tatiana. Tom, I wanted to ask you, we talked a lot about sanctions on energy and the disruptive effects of the war on energy supply. What about on the Russian side with things like aluminum and nickel and all the vast sort of palladium, all the resources on the mineral side that Russia has? How have they been affected by war and the sanctions? How does it compare to the situation on the energy side?
No, it's a good question. I think there's sort of two sides to that. The first one is sort of the base metals, as you mentioned, nickel, aluminum, copper. They fell under a sanctions regime that has impacted some of these producers. Norilsk and others before were very important suppliers to the global market of not just nickel, but also battery grade nickel, which of course today matters quite a bit. And same thing for aluminum. I think the initial fear was we put sanctions on that, this is going to increase the price. No, obviously that's what we always see, right? Conflict increases in price. But actually we haven't really seen that materialize in the markets. There was sort of a short price increase and then sort of a reduction because of, I would say, 2 or 3 main reasons. The number one being that just bearish markets in general, even for base metals, it wasn't that bad. Secondly, price sort of reductions, and the price was kept under control by alternative supplies. For nickel, that was specifically Indonesia then, where we have seen in the last 4 or 5 years an increase in nickel production and new technologies to basically turn that nickel into battery-grade nickel at a pace that we didn't really predict before. And those are mainly Chinese operators who are able to do that. But that sort of kind of, shielded our vulnerability to price hikes from the sanctions, right? And then there was also cooperation, actually, not too different from what Tatiana was saying before, cooperation between Russian companies and Chinese companies in joint ventures to try to circumvent some of the sanctions. Now, that's kind of on the base metal side. On sort of the precious metals, the platinum group metals, palladium. Actually, they did not fall under the sanctions regime, and the pressure has been increasing quite a lot since then. And I think to a certain extent that makes sense. If you look at sort of the share of production of aluminium or nickel, you look at sort of 5%, 10% of global production. These are big numbers. But you go to palladium, and Russia was supplying about 40% of global palladium. So you realize you have a completely different problem at your hands if you include that in your sanctions regime. But at least here in the United States, the pressure has been growing. This sort of single operating palladium mine in the United States in Montana had to fire several hundred people 2 months before the presidential election last year. That's the Sibanye Stillwater mine. They claimed that this was because of sort of Russian exports. They used the word dumping as well. So there's now quite a bit of pressure to actually include palladium under the sanctions regime, or actually just ban it off the US markets altogether. That's kind of the discussion that we're seeing right now. But in terms of effects on, again, major Russian producers, I think for the nickel aluminium, it was more substantial, definitely than for the palladium guys.
It just shows you in all these cases, energy and minerals, and even the potash and fertilizer and everything else, that market conditions and availability of supply from other markets play such a critical role. So, Kadri, let me ask you, we've talked a lot about the Russian attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure of various kinds, refineries, power plants, etc. The EU, especially with where Trump seems to be going, is going to need to play a leading role in rebuilding the Ukrainian energy system once we actually have a ceasefire. How are preparations and how is the conversation going in Brussels about rebuilding Ukraine's energy system, and what role will the EU play in that once we do get to a ceasefire?
Well, our understanding is that since Ukraine was granted a candidate status, we have to rebuild Ukraine, keeping in mind that one day they are full member of European Union. So first, their market design and market rules have to be aligned with ours, especially since 2022, Ukraine is already synchronized with European synchronous area, not only Ukraine, but also Moldova. So at this very moment, well, all the thermal power plants are destroyed, and the biggest European nuclear power plant, Zaporozhye, is occupied by Russians. So they are in the position where they have to import electricity from Europe. They don't have extra capacity to sell electricity as they hope that one day they will have again. So what are Europe's major concerns? I think that one of the biggest concerns is the same Zaporozhye nuclear power plant that is already many years occupied by Russian military. There is no maintenance taking place, and despite the fact that this power plant is in cool down mode, someone someday has to decide what will happen with this power plant. So last year, Russians were well thinking that maybe it would be possible to relaunch the operations of Zaporozhye power plant. I strongly believe that this is not so easy. First, they blew up the Kakhovka dam. So this nuclear power plant doesn't have access to water reservoirs as it had before 2022 when full-scale war started. And second, well, the mere fact that Russian troops are using reactor rooms to hide their military equipment also hints that we do not know what are the conditions for nuclear safety perspective. So Europe strongly believes that we can rebuild Ukraine's energy system. We are already paying for new renewables. For example, this Energy Community Support Fund that I launched 3 years ago, it has massive funds bookmarked for renewables, and with the help of these funds, Ukraine was able to initiate a support scheme for rooftop solar, both for public buildings, schools and hospitals, but also for private houses. And we have signed with Ukraine MOU on biogas, because this idle gas infrastructure can actually also, you can inject biogas. And by doing so, Ukraine can become again a gas exporting country. So there are many operations ongoing. Unfortunately, Europe cannot support new nuclear reactors and building them. We don't do that in Europe. We have never financed nuclear power plants. The only thing where we have been financing a nuclear sector was that 2 of our member states decommissioned Chernobyl type nuclear power plants when they joined European Union, and this is extremely expensive operation. So might be also the future of the Zaporozhye power plant, and then just to take care of nuclear safety. This has been always the European priority.
And just a reminder to the audience that, I'm going to go to the audience questions here in a second, but feel free to use the link in the chat to send your questions in, and we'll answer those here in a moment. But before I do that, Kadri, one more question for you, which is, you mentioned biogas and renewables, and we've been through a period of energy crisis in Europe. It's been a little bit better the last year or so, but have you seen any changes in the direction of EU climate policy, not just towards Ukraine, but for its own, Fit for 55 goals, its own Paris Agreement commitments, NDCs? Has that been changed by the energy shock and what's happened in Russia, Ukraine, or is it still basically on the same trajectory it was before the war?
No, since 2022, we were able to increase our targets both for renewables and energy efficiency significantly. So this gas crisis accelerated our green transition. And why it was so? Because we saw that back 2022, it was impossible to cover Russian pipeline gas with LNG shipments. So we had to find other means. So first we prioritized savings. But second best option was to replace in power generation gas with renewables. And since then, each year has been the new record year for solar and wind in Europe. And that means that Europe has kept its promise to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030. Saying that, there are still ongoing discussions what should be the target for 2040. And of course, new European Commission also presented Clean Industrial Deal to support European competitiveness. And part of it was action plan how to secure affordable energy. So against whom they are comparing us? Against United States. And United States is in the position where they are producing enough gas for domestic demand, but also for export. And the very moment when they ship LNG from their terminals to Europe, then this will be traded commodity and it arrives to Europe with significantly higher price than Americans can consume the same gas. So we have to electrify. And we have to also scale up the green hydrogen economy. This is our reading. And this is good also not only for our competitiveness, but helps us to meet our climate targets too.
Great answer. I think that sometimes the effect of the war and the energy shock on Europe is portrayed differently, that, oh, they're going back to coal or they're finding whatever's available. But I think you answered that question very well. So we have a tricky question here in the chat, but I'll throw it out there and see if anyone wants to answer. And basically the question is asking really honestly about the sort of Zelensky-Trump dynamic and the Ukraine-US dynamic. And the question really is reacting to what Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, said today, that maybe the US will move on if they can't get this rare earth deal and everything else that they want in the ceasefire negotiated. How should we read that in terms of the state of this, Zelensky-Trump, US-Ukraine relationship? Obviously, the February 20th meeting was kind of a disaster. I think that's the general consensus, at least for the Ukraine side. But does anyone have a view on how we should read into this comment from Rubio and how the Ukrainians are viewing things in Washington these days? Any takers on that one? Not an easy question.
Let me try, RJ. I think it is warning not for Ukrainians, frankly. I think it's the warning for Russians and for Putin personally. That, okay, after several exchanges of opinions and nice words from both sides and different gifts which were going back and forth from Moscow to Washington, it's time to start real action on the ground. And as I said, the energy infrastructure ceasefire just ended up yesterday. And Russian president's press secretary mentioned today that there was no new order from Supreme Major Commander on keeping any ceasefire, which means that right now Russia feels that there are no restrictions for new attacks. This is a message from Moscow that we didn't get what we want from the US. We didn't get any, sort of remuneration for ending the military, the war. Yeah, so we keep doing what we did before. Obviously, this is unacceptable for the US representatives, which were providing certain hopes and aspirations as an attractor for negotiations, but not something that Russia will get beforehand. So I think it's basically the last warning from the US side that, guys, just compare. You have two options. Either you stop fire, you sit to the real negotiations table, you make some concessions, you have to give something up. You cannot get it all, the whole wish list. But as a longer term outcome, you can hope for growing economic cooperation with the US, which Russian leadership obviously loves, at least talking about this idea. It is bestseller for the domestic public. It is really like putting Russia very high on the global arena as a real big player comparable with the US, at least in the eyes of the Russian leadership once again. It has at the same time very dangerous geopolitical second line, which is affecting Russia-Chinese relationship. And Russia-Chinese trade balance, it's much more impressive. So it's like 30% of all Russia's international trade these days. China is the major supplier of basically all manufactured goods and equipment for the Russian market, and the main off-taker of Russian oil, the biggest single off-taker of Russian gas. So ruining relationship with China doesn't look as an attractive. At the same time, so it seems that Kremlin is now trying to maneuver between China and the US, getting benefits from both, which is not possible in the modern geopolitical landscape. So I believe what Rubio said was specifically targeted to Putin, saying like, it's time to decide on which side you are with us, and then you will get some profits out of it. If you are not, then we wash up our hands and we stop it, and then you will have to solve all these issues yourself. Kadri, what's your reading?
If I may add one other aspect. So at the very moment when President Zelensky left Oval Office, he came to Europe, where he met in London with European leaders and Canadian Prime Minister, who were very clear that they back only these kind of peace talks where Ukraine is deciding about its future. And this was very different compared to them a couple of years ago when Biden administration announced that they will withdraw from Afghanistan. And well, other NATO and well, European partners said that, okay, if you will leave, we have nothing else to do, we will leave too. In Ukrainian case, nobody was hesitant. Well, we stay there until it takes to support Ukraine. And I think that Trump administration receives this strong message each time when they have any kind of interaction with Europeans. For example, yesterday when Giorgia Meloni, who really likes Trump, visited White House, she was also very clear in her support to Ukraine, because this is overall reading of the map in Europe, that we have to make sure that you will not negotiate something that is giving up your rights and sovereign rights for your independence and control of your borders. So I think that over the time, this new US administration understands that this is not only them who can decide the course of action. There are other players who are willing to scale up their support. And I'm coming from Estonia. Well, for example, my current government back home has announced that they will dedicate 5% of GDP to the defense budget, and they are still continuing their strong support, also military support to Ukraine. So the Trump administration has not convinced Europeans to do or to leave Ukraine alone.
Those are both very comprehensive answers to a challenging question. Well, we're almost out of time. There's one more question in the chat, Kadri, which is probably best directed to you, which is when going back to the topic of rebuilding Ukraine's energy system, one of the participants in the call asked about whether Europeans will work on the gas sector, particularly gas storage. Or maybe Tatiana knows, is there going to be some reconstruction work on the gas storage sites? So I think Tatiana, you mentioned, or Kadri did, that the pipelines themselves haven't really been damaged, but the thermal power plants, the production side, what about the storage sites? Do those need to be rebuilt as well? I think that's what the question was about. And would the Europeans help for gas storage in Ukraine?
Let me start while Kadri is connecting. Look, Ukraine has the largest underground gas storages in Europe. So it's really a very valuable asset, especially given the seasonality of gas demand. So as Ukraine will be more and more integrating in the European energy space, it would, of course, make sense to use these assets and to use this flexibility. Yeah. So I think at a certain point, it will become part of the overall European gas network, but it also needs security guarantees. If it is bombed on a regular basis, like it is right now, then none of reasonable traders will take a risk to put their gas for winter or for summer storage there. Which is a shame, because if these assets are utilized, it will really improve significantly the reliability and overall flexibility of gas supplies to the Central European countries, at least. So it's something really valuable, but it's very difficult to utilize it properly right now. Kadri, what do you think?
The usefulness of storage comes due to the fact that Europe is heating its homes by using natural gas. So 40% of the gas consumption goes to the building sector. And while heating takes place starting from October until March, this is the period of the year when Europe consumes more gas than LNG terminals can accept. Saying that, European Union has also set a target that the natural gas consumption will decline by 30% by 2030. So year by year, the need to store these volumes is declining. I think that that since we agreed with 27 member states that that there is a certain volume of storage that has to be filled before every heating season, that helped us to calm down the spot market, the LNG spot market that hit records in August 2022. But overall, the gas storage will not provide Ukraine significant revenue. Their own production might do so. So production of biogas, biomethane, why not green hydrogen? And of course, if they can bring online more power plants, keeping in mind that if the reconstruction starts, then Ukrainian domestic demand for electricity should increase too. So right now, just significant demand from industrial sector has disappeared, but we all hope that it returns when peace is agreed.
Well, that's a very good optimistic note to end on. So Kadri, Tatiana, Tom, thanks to all three of you for a great discussion today, answering all these questions. And thanks to our CGEP events team for organizing this session. And thanks to everybody who joined the call. We really appreciate you supporting CGEP and participating in our events. So I think with that, we'll adjourn and stay tuned for announcements for us on our next rapid response call. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.